What's good, everybody? It's your boy, Warren Shaw, welcoming you to another dope interview session. I'm your host, Warren Shaw, and today we're joined by our film director, Mat Whitecross. Matt, how are you doing today, brother? It's so nice for you to join us here, man.
I'm good. Better for seeing you, Warren. How's things?
I can't complain, man. I'm doing a lot better after taking part in seeing your film, The Kings. And for our fans and listeners who don't know, The Kings is a 4-part documentary series on the Showtime network, outlining the boxing history in the 80s of Sugar Ray Leonard, Marvin Hagler, Thomas Hearns, and Roberto Duran. Matt, you did a great job with this thing. I kind of want to start there. And one of the ways I judge documentaries, especially sports documentaries specifically, is if my wife will even take a little bit of interest, right? So I'll tell you a quick story. I put it on while she was out, and I was like, all right, well, maybe she'll let me watch it, or maybe she'll order. Like, I'll go watch it in the room, if anything. So I put it on. I like midway through episode 1, she comes in. She's like, well, what is this? So I give her the brief background on it, and she was hooked. And our thing here is like, when we are going to start to binge something, is like, want to run another? She's like, run it. So we watch all 4 of them straight. So that's a little insight into kind of our household and family, and to show you what a great job you did, where you got my wife who could care 2 craps about boxing and sports, where she was just interested in the story that you were telling, man. So congratulations on that, bro.
Oh, wow. That means a lot. It's funny because I have a similar kind of thing in our house, that my wife traditionally falls asleep in the first 5 minutes of anything. So I've got to choose very carefully. And there's a whole system of, like, she has a very difficult job, so she doesn't want to watch anything that's too difficult and too, like, it's going to make her feel sad. So There's a whole process of negotiation. But yeah, I definitely felt like with this subject matter, what I didn't want to do was just make something that was going to appeal to boxing fans, because I feel like a lot of boxing fans probably know this story, or even if they don't, they're going to watch it anyway. I kind of wanted to broaden it, because from my perspective, boxing at its best tells you something about who we are as human beings, tells you something about society. So I wanted to try and open that up as much as we could.
No, I think you did a great job with it, for sure. And we'll get into a little bit about it. So just tell me, how did the project come to you? What made you accept it, and kind of some of the inner back workings of the process to begin with.
Well, so I'd made a film a few years ago about a British band, Oasis, called Supersonic, and the team behind that had previously made Amy and Senna. And then we're in the process of making Maradona. I think we're just starting to do Maradona maybe. And they came to me with a few projects afterwards, because we had such a great time on it. And each time it wasn't quite right for me, or the timing was bad, or something didn't quite work. And then they came with this project about the 4 Kings. And I did one of those, I kind of took myself out of it initially. I did one of those kind of double takes where I was like, well, am I the right person for this? Because, of course, like a lot of people, I am kind of mesmerized by boxing. I appreciate how important it is to so many people, but I'm not like a fanatic. Like, I've watched a lot of the big fights, but I feel a little bit conflicted about boxing in general. I think it's amazing, and the skill, the athleticism, the courage of the people who go into the ring is undeniable. On the flip side, I can also see the damage it does to people. And I can see the brutality of it, obviously, but I can also see the damage it can do further down the line, in terms of, it could just be financial, it could be mental, physical. And so that side of things always kind of bothered me. And I said that going in, it's like, I'm going to have to do a lot of homework coming into this, because I was a little bit young to appreciate these fights first time round. And I feel like, do you want someone who is a super fan, or do you want someone from outside the boxing world? And they said, no, that's fine. And the other issue I kind of had was like, look, is it okay if I start talking about my feelings about this when we're making it? Can we use the documentary in some way to explore these issues that we're talking about? And they said, yeah, we like the idea of that. So that's more or less how it kind of got handed to me. So it wasn't my project. And then the next step was to go and talk to Showtime and make sure that they were happy with our angle on it, our take on it. And they were great. And what was lovely, I've never had this before from a financier. We went over to New York, we met Vinny and Steven. They just said, look, we trust you guys. We like the stuff you make. You go off, we're here to help, but otherwise we'll kind of see you at the other end. We'll offer you comments when you're further down the line. And the only time they really got involved was like halfway through when we were making it, and the story was getting too long because there was so much to try and tell. And they just said, well, look, we'll just give you more time or more money. I don't think that's probably ever happened before. Probably will never happen again in my life. But it was great. It was amazing. So they recognized the importance of this story. It was something they felt was important to tell.
Oh man, well don't put that out there. I mean, if you're doing good work, people are gonna back the project, Matt. You know what I mean? So I think in you telling that story in that way is for your future projects to be like, listen, let Matt do what Matt does. You know what I mean? let his team ride out and they'll be all right. Listen,
Thank you.
how long did this take to kind of put together? Like just, again, you said that wasn't your project originally, so to speak, but just kind of start to finish, how long did this all kind of come together?
It took more or less 2 years in total, not intentionally. I mean, I had another project that I was working on just before, and we couldn't raise the money. It was a drama, so we had the actors, then we didn't have the money, then we had the money, but we lost the actors. So it was one of those things that happens on every indie film, probably. Yeah. And so it just landed at exactly the right time. And I thought, well, this would probably take 6 months maybe, and then I'll be ready to go back to the other project. And then I got swept up in it. And, the nice thing about the way the producers like to work was they said, look, we want to give you time at the beginning, immerse yourself in the subject matter, talk to everyone, speak to the boxers, speak to all the people in their entourage, all the people from that world. And we want you to, before you even start editing, and that had never happened to me before. Normally it's like, you go into a documentary, because there's not normally that much money, they say, okay, here's the money. And by the way, we need a cut next week. And this was the opposite. They were like, no, take a bit of time to familiarize yourself and do the research. So that was the first part of it. Then we got to meet everyone. Then we started working on it and editing it. And it was complicated to try and tell the stories of, 4 boxers, plus their families, plus the background, plus all the entourage, plus all the ins and outs of boxing. And then on top of that, we wanted to try and tell the story of America and Latin America during that time. So yeah, it was tricky. How do you make all those strands, all those stories feel like just one story? So that took a while. And then we got halfway through, and then Showtime gave us an extra episode and more money, which was amazing. It's what we wanted. But suddenly all the cliffhangers that we had at the end of each episode all went in the wrong place. And, it was tricky to kind of change it all. And then finally COVID hit and we were still working. So then, like everyone, we had to kind of deal with that. So yeah, it took a while, but it was, the whole time I felt very privileged to be doing it. It was definitely and I recognized very early on that these were 4 lives that need to be honored in the same way that maybe the heavyweights of the previous era and the following era in the shape of Ali and Tyson, they're always talked about, but maybe the 4 Kings less so. And I felt like they deserve to have their story told too.
Oh man, I think even kind of ending off on that last point you made there, because it's very easy to try to go to the people that are most recognizable and the most. And obviously of this group, that's Sugar Ray, probably the one that everyone is most familiar with. He's still very visible, even in the boxing society right now. But was that something that you were challenged to do in trying to make sure that each one of these boxers were portrayed equally and got their respective stories told in the way that it needed to be told?
Yeah, 100%. And that was the balance was a tricky thing to try and get right, because like you said, Ray is the guy that, is still very much a familiar presence for a lot of people. He's out there in the limelight. And that was part of the story, was the fact that, all the attention initially was around him, and the other 3 resented that to an extent, and it fueled them, and it motivated a lot of the fights that came later. So you can't really tell the story of the 4 Kings without starting with Leonard. So that felt like the way in. But what I loved about the opportunity we had over 4 hours was that you can you start off with the story of Leonard, and maybe you feel like it's just going to be his story, and he's our hero. He's good looking, he's charismatic, he's the new Ali, he's been handed the mantle from Ali, and he immediately, like his first fight, he's right out there, he's already earning tens of thousands of dollars. But then suddenly you wrong foot everyone at the end of the first episode and he loses, and there's like, oh wow, hang on, so now it's going to become a very different story. So I like the opportunity to play around with people's expectations. And I guess you have a kind of stereotypical image of each of the 4 at the beginning. You have the hitman. Okay, he knocks people out. He's like, people talk about him, even his friends like Jackie say, oh, he was a freak of nature. He's this guy who's larger than life, but actually he's a gentle giant. So you have this other side to him, and gradually you get to tell that story. And the same thing with Hagler, the same thing with Duran. There's the persona that they create that makes them ferocious in the ring, but then there's the human being behind that. And what I loved is like we could play around with that in episode 1, and then we have 3 more hours to then explore who they really are. But yeah, you're right. It was tricky to try and find that balance, and for a long time we struggled, especially in episode 1, because not some of the big fights and some of those encounters don't happen till to the 3rd or 4th episode. So, for example, with Marvin, Marvin doesn't really start getting into the action until later on. Yeah. The first 2 episodes, the beginnings, really are about Duran and Leonard. So how do you make sure we're dividing it evenly? But I felt like we got to a good place by the end, but it wasn't easy.
No, for sure. And again, I can appreciate the process, in that as well too. I think just we all understand certain things, like you want a story to tell, and then there's complexities of that, and especially with that particular group, because one of the things you mentioned, you talk about there, they are touchy about each other. Yeah, I mean, like really, truly, like they're touchy about
still
each
now.
Other. Yeah, like so. I use a line from Nas, rapper who said this one time: "Some beefs are everlasting," and while there's always a mutual respect, it's like certain things, like listen, you know what I mean? It is what it is. I think with them, that's definitely holds true.
100%. No, it's interesting, isn't it? Because even though they're all kind of friends in inverted commas, like there's enough water under the bridge. Even when we started on the project, Showtime were like, look, just so you know, there's going to be an issue with who you approach at what time. They said, well, look, we think Ray will be fine. Ray's great. He doesn't mind, he doesn't have an ego about these things. But if you approach Marvin first, his nose might be out of joint. So then, but also if you talk to Tommy, then maybe there's an issue with someone else. So, in the end, we decided we'll approach everyone at the same time. But it's like when you talk about these bands from the 70s, like Led Zeppelin or someone. It's like if you're going to try and make a film about them, it's like, well, what order do you approach them? And if you speak to one of the band members, they go, well, I don't want to be in the show. So yeah, it's complicated even now, all these decades later.
Yeah, man. Well, I love again how the story is portrayed, and just talk to me a little bit about maybe some of the other challenges, even in that, when it comes to approaching their teams and the promoters and the trainers and everybody that was around, all 4 of these guys. And, I'll talk about this in a little bit as well too, but boxing is extremely political. There's a lot going on in the workings of that. Was it difficult to really try to get everybody together to give you the information that you wanted to try to tell the story accurately and fairly, and some of those who maybe declined to participate and maybe you still need to get some information about them?
Yeah, it's always tricky, and I think in documentary in general, you have to come at it from a point of humility and go, look, we're going to try and tell someone else's story. And that might be a band, or it might be an astronaut, or it might be an ex-president, whatever it is. And, no one has a God-given right to tell anyone else's story. So I never assumed that everyone's going to want to work with us and talk to us. On the other hand, we were trying to tell it as completely as we could. And we came in with good intentions. So you hope that if you get on the phone with someone or you get in a room with them, then they'll meet you, they'll take you at your word. But it's tricky, there's a lot of trust involved. And particularly we then, halfway through the project, obviously you're in the COVID world, so you end up having to do some of the stuff remotely. And if you're not in the same room as someone, that's hard. Plus, the bigger the star or the bigger the band, the more layers in between you and people who want to talk to them, right? So,
yeah,
I've worked with bands like the Stones or U2 or Led Zeppelin, and there's so many different layers in between the band, for often for good reasons, sometimes not for good reasons. And so the same with boxers, right? That you want to talk to Ray, but you got to talk to an agent, and the agent isn't the person you should talk to. You got to talk to someone else.
Yep.
And half the time it's like, well, if you can talk to, someone's wife or their children, sometimes that's a better way in. I mean, my experience is, like film and TV is pretty chaotic. I'm married to a doctor, and she laughs when she hears about the way that the film and TV can be sometimes. It's pretty crazy. Then I step into the music world every so often, and you're like, oh, this is complete chaos. But then you go into the boxing world, it's like a whole new level of insanity. Yeah. So that's something we had to deal with a little bit. But yeah, generally we just reached out to people. Most people, when they heard what the subject matter was, of course, they want to talk about that era. So that it wasn't too difficult. Then we just needed an in with most of the more important people. So, for example, we talked to Jackie Callan, not with any ulterior motive, just because she was there. And at the end of that interview, we said, look, we reached out to Tommy. We haven't heard yet. She said, oh, no, look, I'll put in a word. And then like a week later, we were on the phone to Tommy. So generally speaking, I think it was the same with Roberto, that we reached out to his family and his son connected us. Generally speaking, people will take your word, but it's complicated, right?
Yeah, no, for sure. And so in my normal world, I'm primarily dealing with NBA players and athletes and stuff like that too. And man, it is layered. It's like you have to know a guy who knows a guy sometimes, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or girl, you know what I mean? To make sure that you can get what you need to get out of that. We're talking with Mat Whitecross from the Kings. Follow him on Twitter at Mat Whitecross, or on IG at _Whitecross. Don't you hate when they steal your stuff and you have to be you're one thing here and then you're another thing there? Oh, that drives me crazy.
It's true. It's like what we were saying before. It's like a good full-time job just to stay on top of all these different ways of communicating with people. You need like a team.
For sure, man. It's wild. But one of the finer details I think about this is, how you wove politics into it. And I know you've discussed that on various platforms that you've been on previously, or whatever the case may be. We just talked about how boxing is political, it's its own political environment in that of itself too, but the 80s and Reaganomics and so forth and so forth. But you said earlier that you kind of had the blessing, from those above, and the executives say, hey, take that route and do that. What made you want to tell the story in that way? Just because that way it wasn't such a linear boxing piece? Is that why you kind of did that way?
Yeah, partly that. And I think also the thing for me was, I think exactly like you said, like life is political, even though we don't think so. I think in the last few years, we've started to realize it more. But, politics impacts on everything. Everything is connected in some way. And I felt like, well, one side of it was, I don't know that you can really understand these 4 lives without looking at the bigger picture. And I don't think you can really understand boxing without looking at the bigger picture at that time. I really felt like we were, of course, we're telling the story for everyone, for people who were there at the time, but also for a new generation. And the reality is, it's like, you talk to a kid on the street, they might know who Reagan is, but they might not. So I thought that was important to try and fill in some of the blanks.
Sure.
And then the thing for me, there's something, I don't know if it's unique to boxing, but it definitely is at its most extreme in boxing, is that, in the way that Teddy, Atlas, and a few of other of our contributors said it to us, was just like, there's something particular about it. It's one person going in against an opponent. And there's something that lends itself to metaphor and to talking about the bigger world outside. Yeah. And especially back then, when 2 people went in and they represented something, they represented maybe a country, or in the case of Tommy Hearns, they represented a city. And you're not just going in, it's not just two men in there. It's like the hopes and dreams of different communities and different countries. So there was that side of things. And then plus, I just felt like the previous era, now the way we talk about Ali is like, well, he is a figurehead for the civil rights movement, or you talk about Tyson and he somehow represents the end of that era of like bigger is better, greed is good. Whether that's true or not, that's the version of that history is now representing. And I felt like, well, the 4 kings also represent all kinds of angles of their era. And so it's a nice way of kind of hopping back and forth and talking about what was going on in America at that time. And originally, when we had a much longer show, obviously then you have to cut it down so that it's broadcastable, but we had other tangents. We'd go into the mafia corruption during the time of Ray Arcel, who was Roberto Duran's trainer. And so we had a whole section on there about mafia corruption and how that gradually transformed into white collar corruption, for want of a better word, in the modern era, where people are still getting ripped off. It's just they don't get hit over the head with a kosh. They just get ripped off, and they suddenly realize they're left destitute after having fought their whole lives. So there are a lot of different angles in there, and I just felt like, of course, there's a straight version of this where all you do is talk about the technique and who won and who was up and who was down in each fight. But that felt quite reductive to me, and not really what's going on in any one of those fights in history.
So, I mean, and as you touched on here a little bit, right, because of the time that was going on then, and maybe even some of the times that are happening now with people of color, just for you to be able to tell that story in this time as well too, does it become doubly important, more stressful, even in a way, because it resonates even now, especially with what kind of our society is?
Yeah, I felt definitely there were lots of resonances as we were working on the show. It's like, obviously we've been going through very tumultuous times right now. Mm-hmm. And the BLM movement, there were things were going on during the period where we were editing where we were watching footage of the uprisings in Newark and Detroit, and it just looked like CNN right now, you know. And in some ways, I think life is cyclical. You can see that you know, the same team behind Reagan with the team behind Trump. They even have the same catchphrase, which obviously we use in the show. And a lot of this stuff is unresolved. And I hope that in some ways, you know, all the injustices that are going on right now, they flared up to such an extent that maybe finally they're being addressed in some way. But, you know, I think for a long time in this country, in the UK, and also probably in the US, people got a little bit complacent. You know, you guys voted in a black president. It was like, okay, great. Well, things are slowly getting better. We're fixing a lot of the problems from the past. But actually, I think you only have to look at the last administration to realize that maybe some of it was just papering over problems that were there and really hadn't been addressed. Hopefully they're starting to get addressed now, but the danger is we just keep on coasting along, and then, you know, in another 30 years, the same thing happens again. So it felt important for me to talk about the uprisings then and the injustices that these four guys faced in their lives. And, you know, and then you go back another generation or two generations before that. And for me, it was, you know, there were images even when the guys have their weigh-ins before a fight. And there was something very stark about some of the imagery. I remember seeing Marvin Hagler go in there, and he would strip down completely naked in front of all these kind of white guys, and they sit there and they weigh him and kind of prod him and poke him. And that to me looked like, you know, pictures I've seen of slave auctions, you know.
Slavery,
so
for sure.
and of course Ali was famously spoke about that, talking about it as a kind of gladiatorial contest and talking about, you know, having the whiff of slavery about it. So that felt important to talk about, you know. And I think it's tricky because I when we made this, I knew that our take on it politically isn't going to be to everyone's taste, and maybe, you know, because we're making a stand, we're kind of making comments as we go along. It's not a neutral observation, but then I don't think documentary ever is. So I knew it was going to piss off some people. You know, I knew it was going to piss off some fight fans who are like, just cut to the fight. But, you know, that's okay. You know, I think if you make anything, what you don't want is for everyone just to kind of, you know, nods and just go, yeah, that's fine. You know, you want to try and make something that takes a stand. So yeah, let's see. I mean, it's interesting. I try not to read too many reviews, but every so often things pop up when I'm flicking through Twitter or Instagram, and some people are like, this is great. I love the politics. It's adding another layer. And other people are like, why do they keep on cutting to Reagan? This is really, really making me angry, but that's life, you know.
But it's a documentary, right? And I think, like, at the end of the day, like you said, you're going to make some people happy, or you're going to make some people sad, or whatever the case may be, but at least you're invoking some sort of emotion. I mean, they care in some way, and that's, I think, any creator ever wants is like, care about what we put out here, even if you hate it, that's fine. At least you got something out of it, right?
100%.
But it's so funny because when you mentioned that, I think, again, I harken back to my wife, and when we saw like one of the Hagler weigh-ins, she was like, "What?" I was like, "Yeah," right? You know what I mean, like that's what it was, and she said the exact same thing. She was like, "Yeah, it was like the slave trade or something like that, case may be," and you know, it's just. I don't know. I think you guys, you did a really great job in really kind of hitting on everything for each fighter and some of their struggles. And what I think I probably learned the most about Roberto Duran, and just because he's so authentic and even outspoken, but even touching on Emmanuel Stewart and his relationships to Tommy, it really was like because I grew up kind of like you. I think we're roughly about the same age, so to speak. So I remember some of that stuff, but that wasn't my generation. I'm more of the Tyson generation, if you will, where I can like vividly remember kind of what that was like. But seeing Stewart, you know, with Holyfield and things of that nature, and what he was as a trainer, what he was as an analyst and things of that nature, just, you really got everybody. Like, so many great stories from so many great influential people, you know, in the sport. And I wanted to ask, you know, is there something that maybe didn't make the cut? Well, I know there's stuff that didn't make the cut, but, you know, something that like stood out to you that you're like, dang, I really wish I could have got that in there some way.
Yeah, I mean, there were lots of sections that we worked on that I really loved. There was one section, you know, like I mentioned earlier, where we had, so Ray Arcel was someone who was, you know, like a figurehead for trying to clean boxing up in a way that maybe Teddy Atlas has been recently, and a few other figures have been. And he got someone came and smashed him over the head with some lead piping, and he almost died. Yeah, so he ducked out of boxing for a long time, for decades, and it was Duran who brought him back in. And we had a whole section on that, and about, how boxing's always had this kind of illicit side to it, which I really liked. And it was also about their friendship and about Freddie Brown and how the three of them connected, but we just didn't have time for it. There was another section that I really loved as well, which was, I guess we kind of say something similar at the end of episode 1 when we connect boxing to the violence that's inherent in humanity anyway, and say, it's chicken and egg. It's like, well, does boxing make people violent when people are violent anyway? It's not a perfect world. And I liked that as a kind of sentiment, just to try and explore, why are we even telling this story? Why does boxing even exist? And then we had a section at the beginning of episode 3, I remember, where, Reagan's come in with a bunch of policies, which on the face of it, you wouldn't imagine would be very popular, which is like, let's make rich people richer and let's make poor people poorer and cut all their benefits and cut all the support that they would have. So, but then there's this assassination attempt by John Hinckley, and he almost dies, right? So he's whisked away, and then immediately, he's praised as a hero, and they bring him back into Congress, and he waves through all these laws, which normally would be very unpopular, but everyone's like, look, just give him what he wants. He almost died, and simultaneously, there's a lot of changes happening with boxing, and so we kind of had that all as this one centerpiece about what is this violence that's inherent in America, the way that it kind of came through its origins. And there was this great quote from one of our contributors where he said, like, America was born in blood. And it's one of my favorite bits. And then in the end, we were like, well, we're running over. You can take that whole section out, 10-minute section out, and you don't miss it if you never knew it existed. But I miss it because I've watched it 100 times. But, so there's a lot of stuff, but hopefully, I think it happens on a lot of projects that I've worked on, where you often end up taking out your favorite section, and it's kind of counterintuitive. You're like, well, how can you take out the best scene in a drama? How can you take out the best scene in a documentary? But I kind of feel like if that's the scene that is what the whole show's about, then in a way, if you take it out, then the rest of the show should still have it in its DNA. It'll be in there somewhere, even if you cut your favorite scene.
No, that makes sense. I mean, again, it just, the storytelling has to make sense as well too, and not just from your perspective, to the audience's perspective as well too. And I think that's important. And so it sounds like any film, there's a Whitecross cut somewhere, you know what I mean, that
sure.
Maybe we'll get years down the line. Maybe Showtime will release some of that, or whatever, you'll leak that out here. You'll leak it out.
I know, but it's funny, isn't it? Because on every project, even on the Oasis one, we had, I think the first cut was about 7 hours long, thereabouts, and it was supposed to be 90 minutes. I think in the end, we kind of wrestled it down to about 2 hours. But yeah, it's just the nature of documentary making. And even on dramas where, in theory, you're just shooting the bits you need, so it should never be that long. You still end up with like a 3-hour cut. So it's, yeah. And then it's that thing, everyone calls it, killing your babies. You end up having to take out all your favorite bits, and it's just like, but the scene is what the whole film is about. And yeah, but something's got to give.
Nah, man. I think there's just a lot in this docuseries, where there's like the sympathy of some of the, like, even Duran, how he's villain at one part, he's hero at another part, and how that can change so quickly depending on whatever's happening, in the time, and especially after No Mas and everything like that as well too. And again, that stuff is maybe somewhat revisionist, but it was still needed to be in there for how the series was flowing. But other parts, as you alluded to, that you did have to cut out, again, I hope we would get the chance to see that. Before I let you go, just, what did your family think of the work? You know what I mean? I know you have, little girls, stuff like that too. It's boxing and it's a little bit brutal, so to speak. So like, I don't care about that. But what was your family's thoughts on this particular project?
Well, actually, none of them have really seen it yet. I think I did show it to my mum, and I showed it to my wife. My wife enjoyed it. I mean, I think a bit like you were saying about your wife, that it's not like she doesn't find boxing appealing. She thinks she can only see the brutality of it. She doesn't really see the drama behind it and the skill. I think that she finds it too hard to watch. But no, I think she enjoyed it. And again, like your wife, I think she enjoyed the way that we kind of used history as a way of getting into it. So you're being told a bigger story. Yeah, my kids, it's funny. I showed them a couple of the fights. I wasn't really sure whether to show them or not. And they were slightly horrified, but then they got into it and they liked the characters. I explained who the characters were. My eldest daughter, who's 7 now, during lockdown, they had to do, for Black History Month, they had to choose a black figure. to celebrate. And so she did a big poster, like a mural thing of Muhammad Ali. So she knew a bit about boxing, and she had all that in the, so she was like, okay. So I said, well, no, this is kind of about Ali. Ali's in the background of a lot of this. And so that was her way in. But yeah, I think it's fascinating to them. It's so alien to what they know. They both my kids, they're quite young, but they're doing karate now. So they've got some sense of combat sports, and they like that kind of stuff. But it's it's interesting though, because kids can be quite brutal too, right? And girls just as much as boys. So there is a sense they are kind of mesmerized by it, like we all are.
Yeah, it's funny because you mentioned it that way. Because I have some kids as well too, and it's not always the physical nature of the brutality, especially at their age. A lot of time it's the verbal abuse and the bullying and all that stuff now, especially in this era. Two more questions. I know we're kind of keeping here a little bit longer, but I think this is just like great content here. Just where do you think this generation, the Kings generation, if you will, where would it have landed like if social media was around? You know what I mean? And Roberto Duran and No Moss and Sugar Ray with his, kind of, always in the middle of like, again, like I think I saw somewhere he was like Michael Jordan, where he was just politically correct, you know what I mean? at all costs. Where do you think this era of boxing would be had social media had been around back then?
God, it's such a good question, because I think, in some ways, people talk about boxing now, boxing then, about mixed martial arts, those kinds of things. And it's like, well, what is it about that era? Were these guys great anyway? Like, or was it something about that era that raised them up? And I think it's a bit of both. I mean, obviously they're exceptional fighters, but then there was something about boxing in that era that was the sport that everyone gravitated towards. And you would sit there, everyone would watch the fight, no matter where they were from, what country they were from. They would gather together and they would sit down, and it was available on nationally broadcast news. It was on the news. It was nationally broadcast, and so everyone would watch the fight together, and that's what you talked about on the weekend. And that's disappeared now, right? With pay-per-view and the idea, it's become much more niche, and it's become probably more lucrative for promoters and for some fighters. But we've lost a lot of that connection. So I think with social media, I don't know. I think there's lots of ways in which it would have been, people like Duran probably would have been cancelled a long time ago because he has no filter. He would have said a bunch of stuff, which was like, that would have been the end of his career right now. I think Leonard, it would have been another avenue for him to explore. He was very, very smart. He is very smart about connecting with people. He understood all of that before anyone like Michael Jordan. He kind of paved the way for those guys. So I suppose in that sense, social media in terms of connecting with people, that would have been important to him. But yeah, I think it's tricky, isn't it? Because, why is it that it seems to, like, it doesn't have the same value to a lot of people? It's not, people don't connect with boxing in the same way now. It doesn't have that importance in people's lives, and the stories don't have the same importance. As great as those big fights are, it's not the same as that era, and certainly not the same as Ali's time or Tyson's time. So I guess that's probably the reason. But I think, the social media has a lot to answer for, but it might have helped back then.
Oh my God, you're so right though. Cancel culture would have definitely got Roberto. He would have been, in Panama in the parties.
Forget it.
With the girls. Oh my God, it would have been awful.
Could be quite entertaining too.
Oh, for sure. We would have watched. And it would have been probably led to a different type of documentary, at some point as well. Listen, Matt, I want to thank you so much for joining me here on Dope Interviews. I think, it was a great conversation. And just tell the folks again where they can find you and what are some of the next projects you may have working up and coming up next.
Thank you. Well, we're working on a show about the Paralympics at the moment. So we've been following 10 athletes around the world, from as far afield as Iraq, Afghanistan, Norway, Canada. And they've been telling their stories to us for almost 2 years now. So fingers crossed, touch wood, we're going to follow them all the way to Tokyo next month. So that's very exciting. And in the meantime, we've got various different things lined up for afterwards. So it's the usual thing of you're kind of spinning 20 plates and seeing which you can jump onto. But it's it's good. I know it's been a very tough time for a lot of people, but we've been lucky. We've been super busy. So just looking forward to the next project. Oh
man, well, I'm really excited for you. Hopefully we'll get to talk to you again about some of those projects moving forward. I want to thank you, Mat Whitecross, for joining us here on Dope Interviews. I'm your host, Warren Shaw, and this was another Dope Interview. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Warren.